All right, we're going to move on to the last part of our program here. I want to introduce Tina Quigley, who's going to be moderating on our economic commentary. And we kind of put together this panel to, we come up here and we talk about forecasts, we talk about all this legislation that's going on in D.C., and we hear remarks from our folks here working on our behalf in Washington, D.C., our U.S. Senator. But I wanted to kind of bring together also folks who really understand what's going on in the business community and the markets and get their kind of sense of things and how everything's going. So Tina, if you want to come up here and introduce our panel.
Extensive bios for everybody with us today, but I think you're pretty familiar with most of them. We have got Sandip Bhagat, who's our Chief Investment Officer with Whittier Trust. We've got the Honorable Zach Conine, who is our State Treasurer of Nevada, if you guys want to come on up. And we have my friend and somebody I look up to very much, who's doing such a wonderful job here in Southern Nevada, and that is Mary Beth Sewald, who is President and CEO of the Vegas Chamber. So thank you. So you guys are troopers for hanging out with us all the way through the day, but I think this is a really interesting panel. We'll be able to kind of comment on a lot of the stuff that we've heard throughout the day, so thank you for sticking with us. I'm wondering, in all that you've heard today, what stuck with you? What do you think was missed? And what are your own thoughts for 2022 and 2023? Who wants to start?
Well, I just caught the tail end, but I heard a little bit about what Secretary Yellen said, and I think she's excited in a lot of ways about the same thing that I'm excited about, which is the $4 billion worth of infrastructure floating into the state and the 140,000 Nevada jobs it's going to create. We're pretty excited about that at the state level, as we usually are. We talk a lot about jobs, 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 and so any chance we get a chance to use that hashtag, we're happy.
I would actually agree with that, because that's one of the major concerns that we have at the Vegas Chamber, and we are right now facilitating the Good Jobs Challenge. And so for me and for our members at the Vegas Chamber, it's about workforce and workforce development, and we have a lot to talk about today regarding that, but I think that's probably the one key thing that we can look forward to in Nevada especially, is job creation.
Hi. You will find me to be the optimist in the room. So as welcome as additional fiscal stimulus is, I want to leave you with an even more encouraging interpretation and another tailwind on that front. Not only do we have $550 billion in the infrastructure bill, the 1.75 in the 1.75 trillion in the reconciliation bill. We have plenty of monetary stimulus. We have low interest rates. The Fed is committed to keeping rates at zero for the foreseeable future until they are done with the tapering and the asset purchase program reduction that they just announced. Monetary stimulus works on a lagged basis. So the benefits of this will be felt for several more quarters, in addition to the fiscal stimulus that Secretary Yellen was speaking about. And as much as the previous fiscal stimulus seems to be behind us, and it was sizable, it was $5.8 trillion over the last 18 months, there is still a legacy. It wasn't just a sugar high. The legacy from that is a high level of consumer savings, and that will also provide fuel and thrust for additional consumer spending going forward. So I anticipate a very long economic cycle and bull market. So the hiccups of the third quarter, the Delta variant, the slowdown of economic activity that we saw were just bumps in the road. It's really a long road ahead.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask a question for each of you, but since you kind of brought it up, I want to see if you can tell us more about your thoughts about inflation and also what happens if there's another pandemic outbreak.
Okay, so we have a rule here. We cannot use the T word.
Oh,
so, so there are three possibilities that should concern us about inflation. First of all, will these high levels, to keep the theme of alliteration going, will it become runaway and rampant? Number two, will it remain stubborn and sticky? And number three, will it become eventually, let me go with transient and temporary? Let me rule. Yeah, so not runaway or the rampant variety. What we saw in the 70s was created by a supply side shock in oil and food. We don't see any precedents, any signals of that type of an episode unfolding. And then the answer to whether it will be stubborn or transient is actually, it will be both over the next 3 years. It'll remain high and elevated more so than the Fed itself is expecting in the near future. So be ready for inflation close to 4%, maybe 3.5%, maybe 3%. It will not dip below 3% until about 3 years from now. Transient, it must become eventually, because you have powerful headwinds that will contain inflation in the form of technology, demographics, and global competition. So I'll invite comments on inflation, and then we can talk about the other part of your question.
Yeah, I think broadly, from the Treasury perspective, we worry about everything. So seeing inflationary pressures, especially as they impact the Nevadans who have the least among us, right, and are less able to pay for those inflationary pressures, is concerning. I think we also look at just generally the concern about how inflation could tamper some of the efficacy we're seeing on the federal spend side, right? Making sure that we're not paying too much for the materials for new roads and bridges, not paying too much for the component pieces, right, of this work. So I think we're going to be concerned about it a little bit in the short term. But I think you're right. I think most of what we're seeing is a transitory piece of business, and it's not changing our long-term forecasting. Or you're not supposed to say transitory? So, oh, okay. Well, I don't see a kitty, so sorry about that. I thought the T word was going to be taxes. I assumed.
All right. I think the T word is taxes. Actually, yeah, yes. So I think, in terms of, I think we're going to see a lot of inflationary pressure as well. A lot of this is really we talk about it from a global perspective, also a national perspective, and then here at home, we look at the labor market and we talk about jobs, and the listening tour that you all just finished. And so I think that's going to play a major role in how we look at inflation and how we actually respond to it.
Thoughts about moving forward and the impacts that we might see if there's another pandemic outbreak as well. Do you think about that, and what do you think that looks like?
Well, in terms of another outbreak, we're looking at the biggest chamber on a statewide level. We look at the Delta variant and the other variants that are potentially arising that are in the works that we may not even necessarily know about yet. I think there are a lot of things in place. Vaccination is huge. I think we look at Pfizer and we look at children being able to be vaccinated now between the ages of 5 and 12 and so forth. And we've got the antivirus pill and things like that. So I think in terms of the long run, I think we're never going to be back to, quote, normal. I think we look at the workforce and we're looking at the remote workforce and things like that. And the generation, I hear from our members constantly, is that not only it used to be that they used to joke and say the talent pool is very shallow. Now the pool is closed because they cannot find a workforce who is willing to come to work. And so I've jumped around a little bit, but I think it's all interrelated, and it's in terms of when we look ahead on a local level, it's a new normal.
Yeah, I think we are trying to be mostly prepared and resilient for whatever the next downturn is, right? And maybe that downturn is pandemic related, maybe it's not. Hopefully it doesn't come with the loss of life that this last downturn came from, but there will be some other downturn in the future. And so the work at the state level is around building the sort of resiliency in systems, in practices, in stores, and backup, and making sure that we have a strong rainy day fund, which we will soon enough, making sure that we've got that resiliency there, making sure that some of the systems that we saw just did not work at scale during this last downturn work. Things like replacing the unemployment insurance system, right? And building that kind of resiliency. I think if we're able to do that, we'll be more prepared for whatever the next downturn is. There will be another downturn. It's the nature of economies.
Again, I'm more optimistic on this front. Look, we saw what human ingenuity and medical innovation did in the development of a vaccine in record time. None had been developed in less than a year. Each round of lockdown or shutdowns has been shallower than the previous one. Pfizer's antiviral oral drug is a game changer. So this is the beginning of the end of the pandemic. It will morph into becoming endemic. And I dare say by the middle of next year, things might be back to business as we knew it pre-COVID.
So this is pretty inspiring, right, to hear from these three. And I feel like there's a consistent message there that things are, in general, there is no kitty, like Zach said, transitory. They are short-lived or short-lived, and that you each appear to be in your own worlds optimistic moving forward. One last question for the group, and I think you probably already answered it, is what does a combination of supply chain problems, wage growth, inflation, high unemployment, and yet a tight market of job takers mean for tourism and Southern Nevada's economy? A lot of words in there, but basically in this cataclysmic perfect storm of things that are going on, what do you think that means moving forward here in the short term for Southern Nevada?
As much as things may have improved in the recovery so far, I think for Southern Nevada, the best days are yet ahead of the region.
What is going on? You're just trying to end this on a high note.
I told you I would be the most optimistic person on the stage and for the whole conference. So listen, international travel just began a couple of days ago. So you will have an influx of tourists, not just from across the country, but from overseas as well. Las Vegas is more cyclical in nature. It's more sensitive to economic activity. It suffered more on the way down. It will rebound more vigorously. And because it was deep-rooted, this recession, and its impact was so profound and so pervasive, it has taken us some while to find our footing. And I think this economy is just finding traction. And I'm extremely bullish for the next 2 or 3 years.
I would absolutely agree with that, if I may. This community is extremely resilient, and I sit on the board of the LVCVA as well. And so, as we all know, the local tourism, domestic travel started first, and then now we just recently are able to open up our borders. We're able to drive now from Canada and Mexico, and now we're able to receive tourists on a more global level as well, as long as they're vaccinated. And so, in Las Vegas, of course, we have an infrastructure set up, and so when we're able to go back to getting the tourism re-inspired and also rebuild our conventions, I think and we're well on our way to doing that now. And so I would agree with you. I'm also bullish that the fact that we are now already seeing, we also have the Pro Bowl coming up. We have NFL Draft. We have CES. There are so many things to look forward to, and I think it's just the beginning.
Generally agree, although if we can't say transitory, we should definitely not be able to say cataclysmic. Okay. Because, I mean, that's... but I think broadly, we're bullish. We see gaming revenues continue to exceed expectations. That's because not just a combination of pent-up demand, but we frankly just have a better mousetrap, right? And so continuing to invest in this community, continuing to ensure that tourists can get here and have what they need. I think all of the factors that you mentioned are important, and they're friction points, right? And they might bite into profit margin a little bit, and certainly figuring out ways that we can make jobs attractive to workers is a big piece, I think, of everyone's work in the private sector, and figuring out how to not get in the way is a big piece of our work in the public sector. But I think we're all pretty bullish.
All right, bullish. It's a ka-ching. So, Mary Beth, I got one for you. You represent hundreds of businesses across Clark County. We heard today from CBER on their Business Confidence Index that the #1 most concerning issue is finding qualified employees, followed by economic uncertainty. What would you agree with those? Or what other one or two concepts would you say you're hearing from your members that are of biggest concern right now?
The biggest thing that we're hearing from our members, and not just in Southern Nevada, but on a statewide level, and we have members across the country and across the world, and without question, they are all very concerned about an ability to attract qualified workers or workers at all. And so you have people, and were you going to ask a question?
No, I was going to say, and that's kind of, that's been a consistent challenge for Southern Nevada for many years.
It has been, but the pandemic has emphasized that even more because there were a significant number of individuals who just didn't want to go back to work for various reasons. And we've done polls of different individuals, whether they're employers or employees, and that's been the overriding message. The other big concern of our members is supply chain products. So you have people and products, and without people and without products, you have no profit. And so the business is employers are struggling just to keep their doors open. And so when you add on top of that these problems, it's just very challenging. And so we've been doing everything we possibly can to shore up that dire need for both people and products.
Okay, well, do you think that leads into my next question then? Is that, and also CBER, again, as part of their business confidence index, they shared with us that last June when they did their survey that everybody was optimistic on business conditions in the coming months, and that a large percentage predicted a full economic recovery in 2022. Now, these latest numbers that they just presented today showed that there was a bit of a more pessimistic attitude, and that over the coming months, and that there'd be a sizable shift. The recovery actually wouldn't be until 2023. What would you say caused that shift amongst businesses that the results of this survey would be so different?
I think one of the bigger things that caused that shift was we were all in a place where we were very eager to have the pandemic behind us, right? Last June, we were starting to see the numbers going down finally, and everybody got very optimistic. They were looking at a positive economy. Then, it's like taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and then the numbers went back up again. So people were a little bit more nervous. And I think, the Delta variant played a role in a little bit of pessimism. But I think on the flip side of that, to be optimistic about it, when we look at the October jobs report, we added 531,000 jobs back into the economy in October alone, as of October. And it was about a 4.5% unemployment rate. And so that's pretty good. That's pretty positive. And so I think that just those positive aspects maybe haven't caught up with individuals lately and consumers as well. And so I think, like you said, it was negative at first. It was positive at first. Now it's kind of a little bit negative, but I think we're seeing some economic trends that are going to force us positive again.
Nice turn. So I was trying to take you down a path, and you went bullish again. So nice. All right. So, yes, Sandip.
So the Delta variant did slow economic activity down in the third quarter, but as the quarter closed and we saw a glimpse of corporate profits, it turned out that profits were largely unaffected. Not only were they unaffected, they came in surprisingly strong. And looking ahead to the fourth quarter, a real-time metric of GDP or economic activity is now projecting GDP growth of 8.5% in the fourth quarter. This is on the heels of the disappointing 2% number, but the pessimism that prevailed was in the midst of the third quarter as the Delta variant was making its way through the system. As we speak today, it is behind us. We are looking at reopenings, profits are up, and expected economic activity is also projected to go up. Just thought I would add that.
No, I appreciate that.
I labeled myself Mr. Optimism. So.
Well, no, keep the microphone. I'm going to go to you. I'm going to ask you, so what's your take on the fiscal and monetary policies that we're seeing coming out of D.C.? Do you think it's helping the United States and Las Vegas recover from the pandemic? Do you see any pitfalls that we should be thinking about? How comfortable are you?
No, look, we absolutely needed it, right? We had the sharpest recession on record. It turned out to be the shortest one as well, but it was in large part because of the policy measures that we took. With a global shutdown, the global economy had a risk of coming to a grinding halt and then suffering very long-lasting effects as a result of such a shutdown. So it was well-intended, well-guided, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not over. The effect of low interest rates will continue for 2, 3, or 4 more years. We have fiscal stimulus along the lines of what Secretary Yellen suggested. Of course, too much stimulus will lead to speculative activity and build up bubbles. But right now, I think the risk is not doing enough as opposed to doing too much. We haven't reached the point of excesses. It's something to keep an eye on, but right now, we're good.
I want to ask you, I know we're starting to run out of time, but I want to ask you one more question that we've got on the list. The U.S. economy has been experiencing growing inequality in income and wealth since 1980. One aspect of this story is the growth of high-tech startup firms that have turned into huge players, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera. Do you think the Justice Department should undertake antitrust proceedings to break up some of these large companies? Why or why not? Do you have other thoughts on the inequality that's growing?
Yes. So the big players have become quite dominant. We have actually reached an inflection point where digital advertising, for example, is no longer just the purview of Facebook and Google. Apple and Amazon are entering that space as well. So these big players are now beginning to compete against one another in a previously monopolistic situation. So that should ease antitrust concerns. My fear is if you impose more regulation, the problem is that the smaller players in this space will be hurt more by that higher regulation because it's just expensive to implement or overcome that. Mm-hmm. And then the incumbents will have a bigger cost advantage simply from the size. So the attempt at regulation could actually have a perverse outcome in favoring the very large incumbents. Income inequality, gender inequality is an issue, and I'm so glad to see, look, I'll just make one very quick observation. The pandemic had a asymmetrical and very unfortunate impact on employment by gender. And so as policymakers think of ways to heal our economy and society, they would be well served to come up with ideas that help both kind of a social issue and an economic issue. And the emphasis that Secretary Yellen placed on the child care policies is a perfect example. People have shown, research has shown that child care benefits do have a positive impact on employment, but especially so on single and young mothers. And so if you needed any justification in addition to a foundational premise based on morality and intellectuality, here is an economic rationale for coming up with policies that help us solve those issues as well.
Great, thanks. I'll pass it to Zach. I see you nodding your head up and down there before I ask you your question. Is there anything else you want to add on to that?
Well, I mean, I've got an 8-year-old and 2 4-year-olds, and I spend probably about 10% of my waking time figuring out childcare schedules. Mm-hmm. So I deeply, it's hard, and we have resources, right? Mm-hmm. And just today, actually, they announced that the $222 million from the ARP bill that came in for childcare is starting to go out in the form of grants to childcare providers and families who need it. One of the things we heard the most on the listening tour all around the state was the need for childcare, but it was different in different places, right? Some places needed more providers, some places needed facilities, some places had facilities and providers, but needed the money to operate. And so I think the more work that could be done there, shockingly important, right? And we know has returns. I think separately in that, and to the question as to, are we worried about too much stimulus? I think the government has tried both the 1930s version of do nothing and hope everything works out, and when what happened during the most recent shutdown, and this was effective. Now, obviously, every recession is different, but I think that there is a benefit of the federal government saying, especially in this kind of context, we need to keep people okay so that they can recover at the end of it, right? So that they're getting back from a neutral place as opposed to getting back from a big hole. Certainly a lot of the work on the state's perspective, whether it was our $102 million pandemic emergency technical support grant program, the PETS program, the work that we've done to try and keep people in their homes from an eviction or foreclosure mediation process. I mean, all of that is intended not so that people get a windfall, but that people stay at a neutral place so that they can rebuild when they have an opportunity to.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, on a local level, I kind of we go global, state, local. So we just finished a survey of our members, and of the members who participated in this survey, 46% of them who had children who needed childcare said that one of the reasons, the biggest reason that they are having a hard time going back to work is because of childcare, right? No big surprise. And so the Chamber is working with County Commission Chairwoman Marilyn Kirkpatrick to identify funds and ways that we can provide childcare to those parents so that they can go back to work. And we're looking at, we just had a meeting today about how to provide these childcare services to these families, whether it's mobile childcare, whether it's on site. And then we also did a survey of employers too and found some very specific findings about what they can and cannot provide, but would provide if they had some funding or assistance. So that is an enormous barrier to employment for our locals.
All right, thank you for that very thoughtful answer. And as a parent myself, although my kids are older, I can completely identify with some of the challenges that the families are feeling. All right, so Treasurer Conine, you are responsible for the state's bond rating. How much of a challenge was that during the pandemic, but which is one thing, but I also want to know, what do you see going forward for Nevada's credit rating?
Well, I mean, if we knew what I saw going forward for Nevada's credit rating, I'd probably be making more money than the public sector pays. But separate than that, so the Treasurer is responsible broadly for the state's credit rating. We'll toot our own horn for just a minute and say that under me being Treasurer, we have the highest credit rating the state's ever had, which is great because that lets us borrow money for less.
Did you do that yourself?
Oh, well, no, I didn't actually, and this is what's really important. We were able to get the state's highest credit rating, which is A+ or A1, depending on which of the rating agencies you're looking at, because we communicate a ton with our credit agencies. And this was a choice. In past administrations, it would be just kind of wait until you're going to do a bond issuance, and then they would come and you'd tell them about what's happening with the state, and then they'd give you a credit rating. We talk to the rating agencies all the time. When something good happens, we tell them. When something bad happens, we tell them. And during the pandemic, it was really important to us because we had just achieved, when we did our last bond sale, that highest credit rating, right? So November or so of 19. And then all of a sudden, we turned around and had a pandemic. And so during that pandemic, we kept talking to them because we wanted to make sure we didn't get downgraded for a series of reasons, but the biggest is that it makes it harder for the state to borrow money inexpensively. We were able to borrow money during our first issuance, or my first issuance, at a TIC, a total interest cost of about 1.62%, which is the lowest rate that the state's ever borrowed money in the history of the state, right? We don't have great data from the 1880s, but just given what was happening in the world, we feel okay about it, making that statement. That allowed us to generate more than $100 million of new bonding authority, which is how we were able to fund our state infrastructure bank for the first time at $75 million, and how we were able to pay for the UNLV engineering school, right? So that, it doesn't just matter on what a neat score on a page, it matters because you're actually able to do more with it. And so going forward, during the pandemic, we talked to them around pulling the entire rainy day fund from where there's about $430 million in the rainy day fund. We drained the entire thing. And we were making decisions at the state level, legislature, specifically the governor, were making decisions at the state level that were harder to make, right? The cuts were deeper than what a lot of other states did. But we did that because based on the information that we had at the time, that was the right decision to make. Some other states made sort of half cuts and then said, well, we'll come back if it's not as good as we think, and then they had to come back and do more, and that created more friction for them and actually did lead to some downgrades. So we feel pretty good about the credit rating right now. It's public, so I can tell you that in our bond sale that'll go forward in, well, basically 7 days, we're going to have the same credit score that we had last time, which is still, again, as a reminder, the highest credit score in the history of the state of Nevada.
Oh, well, congratulations to you and your team and to all of us in the state. So we're done with our questions of the panel. Thank you. But before we wrap up, I just want to, by show of hands, so how many of you are leaving here today feeling more bullish than you did when you got here today? Raise your hand. So just a few of you, really? So did you already come, let me ask this then, because I got to ask some follow-up questions, because I feel more bullish than I did before. When you got here, were you already, raise your hand if you got here feeling bullish anyway. Oh, because you people are probably really smart, right? You're like all insiders. I only know what's going on in the paper, so. Oh, yeah, we should have. How many of you are leaving here today feeling unchanged? You're kind of the same as where you were. So, okay, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for answering these questions and for listening. Then I am done. We are done.
Thank you, Tina. Let's everyone give Tina another round of applause for wonderful moderation. She's the former director of the RTC here in Southern Nevada. And thank you to our panelists, Sandip, Mary Beth, and Treasurer Conine. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here today. I want to again thank our sponsors above, who have done a fantastic job supporting CBER through the years, and without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we've been doing when it comes to economic research and data analysis. I will announce that our next Outlook will be sometime in April, is what we're aiming for, so make sure you mark that on your calendar. And then if any of you are sticking around, we have some cocktails over at Bahama Breeze starting at 4 if anyone wants to swing by. All right, thank you, everyone.